Chairman, I welcome all of the witnesses who are here. I have a fairly long history with this issue in the Senate, and I can remember when the Senate had pretty much close to zero interest in privacy and data so long as the data was held in private sector hands. We would get quite animated about any data that our national security apparatus might have access to, when by contrast, private platforms had more data on Americans than the most intrusive governments in the history of humankind, and we paid virtually no attention to it. I'm delighted that that wall has come down and that we now see the risks from the huge aggregations of private data in private hands as significant. So I'm delighted that this is a topic. I've also been involved in a lot of the efforts for cyber legislation. At one point, we made a lot of progress on a bipartisan bill focusing on critical infrastructure. My Republican coordinates were Senator Kyle, who was then the number 2 on the Republican side, Senator McCain, who was then chairman on armed services. So it was a pretty high-level operation. We made a lot of progress. We had a considerable number of conversations in the skiff where there wasn't a whole lot of news and noise to be made, but a lot of good, hard, sincere work with people from the private sector and from our defense and intelligence agencies. And when push finally came to shove, the Republican leader went to the floor and said, no cyber bills coming without repeal Obamacare attached to it. So that ended that effort. Then, along with Chairman McCall, I was the co-chair of the CSIS report for the incoming president, which is a very helpful and thoughtful bipartisan cyber analysis. And when President Trump came in, I looked at Tom Bossert, who I think is a very well-versed, honorable professional in the cyberspace, a great technician. And I looked at an attorney general who'd come out of the Senate and a DNI who'd come out of the Senate, and I thought, great, we got a great opportunity here between the substantive knowledge of Bossert and the political savvy in the Senate of Sessions and Coates to get a real bill going. And of course, as you know, all of that has fallen apart. None of them work for the administration any longer, and I honestly couldn't tell you who I should go talk to in the administration about cyber legislation, so low is their apparent level of interest. So I hope that we're finally in a good space to start doing some real work here. In closing up, I have remarks, and I'd like unanimous consent to put them into the record. In closing, I want to make a procedural point here. In the committees, particularly in the Judiciary Committee, we ordinarily operate one of two ways. We either say this is going to be a bipartisan hearing and we work together and we agree on all the witnesses. It's a consensus panels and the shape of the hearing is agreed to beforehand. Or you don't go that way, you do a partisan way and there's a kind of informal rule that one side gets so many witnesses, the other side gets the opposite. And if the minority doesn't think that its views are being fairly expressed by the majority witnesses, they can call witnesses of their own and you get a divided panel, but they're often very interesting. This is a bit of a hybrid. Until last week, we had bipartisan agreement on 2 panels, and all of that changed rather rapidly. I'm not going to get too excited about all of this because the chairman has expressed an interest in trying to make sure that the administration witnesses who we had scheduled will be rescheduled, and I hope that is true. And the panel that actually is here is a panel that was agreed to in bipartisan fashion. But I do believe that if we're going to be doing these bipartisan hearings, then we should see that through all the way through the hearing and not follow the bipartisan path down until the week before and then change to having sudden, unexpected changes made. So I just want to flag that, Mr. Chairman, because I think you and I have done good work and good hearings before, and I want to make sure that our ground rules as chair and ranking member for these hearings are clear with each other. I'm delighted to go forward with this hearing. I appreciate your leadership in this area, and I just want to be very cautious about the hybrid. We're a bipartisan hearing until at the last minute we're not way of doing business. Thank you. Chairman, one of the things that I've been pushing for is for kind of a stress test of the NIST framework to see how good it is at actually performing its assigned task of providing critical infrastructure cybersecurity. I'm reading here, a recent survey of 1,500 business leaders by Microsoft and Marsh found that only 37% of firms believe that soft industry standards like the NIST framework are very effective at preventing cyber attacks. The same survey found that 19% of firms had, quote, no confidence that they could prevent cyber threats, and 22% had no confidence they could respond to cyber events. Mr. Burt, is it time to stress test the NIST framework?
Senator, I think that two things about that survey, which is one that was performed by Marsh in collaboration with Microsoft. First, one of the things that we saw, which we think is a positive development, is that between 2017, when we did it the first time, and then the most recent survey, we've seen that the number of people in these enterprises that were surveyed that are aware of the risks that they face and the need to take steps has increased significantly. And that's a good thing.
But is it enough?
It's not enough. More needs to be done, absolutely. The NIST framework, we believe, we actually were one of the contributors to the NIST framework, working with NIST on that. And we believe that the NIST framework is actually a very useful framework for companies to assess.
Beats having nothing before.
Yep, and companies should be assessing their cybersecurity maturity. We do. It's one of the things that we regularly assess our cybersecurity maturity as a company relative to the NIST framework. And I know from discussions with others around industry in general that increasingly companies are adopting it and using it. I would say one thing, though, that's important here is...
but be quick because my time is short.
I'm sorry. It's very complex. The NIST framework is complicated, and if you don't have a big IT staff, it can be hard to implement.
Correct.
And that's why we've built, together with others in industry, we've built simpler tools for small and medium-sized businesses to apply a simpler version of the NIST framework. But we need more attention paid.
Mr. Carter, between the desire of the private sector not to suffer reputational harm when they've been hit by a cyber attack and the overclassification that the federal government indulges in, how complete do you think the picture is that the American public gets of the extent to which our country and our companies are under cyber attack?
I think the picture is very incomplete, partly because there are a lot of disincentives to accurate reporting by companies, partly because there are no clear mechanisms for consolidation of that reporting, partly because many types of attacks aren't obvious to their victims, and partly because in many cases the information that is shared is anonymized to the point that it's largely useless for understanding the threat environment that we face.
Back to you, Mr. Burt. You guys were the leaders in botnet takedowns. I was fighting to get the Department of Justice to do more on botnets back then when your first complaint was filed. And I was telling Chairman Hawley, we're both recovering lawyers. What a joy it was to read that complaint, A, because it existed, and B, because when you got to count, 6 or something like that, there was a count of trespass to chattels, which is a doctrine from the medieval English common law that I probably slept through in my Foundations of Property Law class. But clearly, Microsoft has been a leader in fighting botnets for a long time. What more could the Department of Justice be doing now to continue the process of constant weed cutting that needs to take place to strip? First, is there any good use for a botnet? Or is it a weed? And second, what more should we be doing to weed whack them?
Almost all botnets are weeds, Senator Whitehouse. There are some for research purposes and others, but those can be identified. In our view, almost all botnets that meet that standard are weeds and need to be eradicated. There's two things that we would like to do with the Department of Justice and law enforcement to improve in this area. One is we need more strategic coordination. And when I meet with leaders across law enforcement and the intelligence community, DHS here, we always talk about public-private partnership, but we aren't doing enough to realize that. And this is an area where we're committed, and we know that if we could meet strategically to identify what are the key botnets, the most impactful, the most serious ones, how can we join together and in collaborative way do something about that? That would be step one. Step two is...
A botnet in a nutshell is a force multiplier for some evildoer.
It's an evildoer who has managed to infect thousands or millions of computers with their malware.
And can deploy those computers.
And they can coordinate cybercrime across all those computers without their victims even knowing that their computers have been infected. And the second thing we need is for the Department of Justice and FBI to have the right incentives and the right priorities paid to reducing botnets, to attack botnets, even when they can't necessarily get handcuffs on the perpetrators because they're living in countries with no extradition or the other challenges that we face in this space. Just disrupting the botnets alone and stopping those criminal enterprises is in itself an important thing to do.
And finally, if I may go on a moment, I've been arguing for quite some time that we should pursue a coalition of the willing to create international cybersecurity norms. I think the Obama administration made a mistake trying to bring the Russians and the Chinese into a productive discussion on this subject. It's a little bit like trying to bring a couple of burglars into a productive discussion on home security. Forget them. I would consider that it would be wise for us to, as a nation, try to set norms with countries that share our values in a secure and safe internet. And to that end, I'm wondering if you believe that the Cybersecurity Tech Accord that the private sector entered into and the Cyber Peace Institute that the private sector has also stood up eliminate that need, or whether this is a pursuit that government should still engage in.
It's absolutely a pursuit government should still engage in, Senator Whitehouse. The Cybersecurity Tech Accord is a group that Microsoft initially set up, but now we have over 120 companies from around the globe who work together to endorse key principles of cybersecurity for their customers, but also to articulate the view of the tech community on key issues about cybersecurity policy and appropriate norms. The Cyber Peace Institute is a newly established nonprofit to be based in Geneva that is going to do work that is not happening elsewhere in government or the private sector to really bring transparency to the impact and of nation-state cyber attacks, the harm, the human harm that these nation-state cyber attacks cause, and to work to increase resiliency around the world to these attacks. Those are both important, but what you said is absolutely right. The United States must join with other like-minded countries to establish enforceable norms of nation-state behavior. And if that means we can isolate those countries that refuse to abide by those rules, so much the better. At least we will have that isolation clear. But we need the United States to play a stronger diplomatic role. There's two pending United Nations efforts underway, one that was initially sponsored by the United States, one initially sponsored by Russia. They're working side by side to try to establish norms of conduct for cyberspace. And we are working on both of those processes to try to ensure that they are productive and result in useful outcomes. But those are both areas where we need the United States to be actively engaged in pushing for these norms.
Maybe even with international sanctions to back up the norms. Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me go on beyond my time. This is a good hearing.